I think a point of inspiration for me is somewhat inherent. I can't remember a time in my life that I haven't been drawn to needing to make a mark of some kind. So I guess nature versus nurture. I think that it's within me a kind of instinct. And as a kid I can recall running my hand through dust to make a mark, making a beeline to windows that had dew on them, and creating something. I always needed to create something. So I guess initially I would say inspiration to create visual art is somewhat instinctive. That being said, I also think that a point of inspiration for me has been a series of different people in my life that have really made an important impact. I think the earliest I can remember is when I was a kid. There was a neighbor, an elderly neighbor, and I used to go to her home, and she would give me paper and I would draw, and we had a real friendship. And I had a very tumultuous childhood, and at one point we were leaving, as in moving away, and I was upset about it, and she was upset too, I could see, but she did something that was really memorable. She held up both my hands in front of me, and she said, what are these? And I said, in my hands. And she said, they're also your two best friends. And as long as you have them, you'll never be alone. And at the time, it didn't make a lot of sense to me, but over the years, it made more and more sense to me. So that really, I'm very grateful that I've had people like that have come along and impacted me in a way that keeps me connected to my art. I've also had art teachers who were really responsive and connected to what my vision was, as opposed to what they wanted to superimpose over me. And then I would say I was never that influenced or inspired by the art world per se, even though there's certain artists that I really admire, like Cy Twombly or Paul Klee, or the sort of more whimsical artists. But that came later, and I was well into my art by the time I was even aware of other artists. So the real inspiration seems to be from elsewhere, although the others were supportive and encouraging. When I'm in the studio and I'm really creating and things are going very, very well, there's a sense of flow, a kind of challenge and accomplishment that are very well balanced, and it really keeps me, it's almost timeless. It's a very positive feeling, and it's one that is not always there per se. And when it is there, I really honor it and give all the energy that I can to let it keep going. Some people call it a muse or whatever. It does feel external, and I have noticed that when I'm in the studio and I'm doing something, my internal dialogue is very plural. Like I'll say, we should add blue to this, or we should stop here and do this or that. And I don't do that the rest of my life. When I'm driving, I don't say we should turn left, or and I don't know why I do it when I'm creating, but I seem to. And I wasn't really even aware of that until the last few years when I've been asked about what the process is. So it's very much a kind of, I think the word flow does describe it well. I think the world needs art because the human world has always had art in it. We have a whole history around art. As far as visual art, we have evidence of that going all the way back to the earliest human beings. We have a passion for leaving our mark, and we've done that consistently through generations. So I think the evidence is there that it's just part of who we are. And I would say equally, I think individually, the artists who create art need art. It's a form of communication. And I think that we need that communication in our culture, that there's a kind of knowing that is beyond words. And certainly with visual art, we can take people there and communicate that. Yeah, a lot of my creativity or my urge to create something does seem to center on a kind of self-journaling, in the sense of I want to narrate something that I've either experienced or learned. So I would say the inspiration is really in what I'm living. For instance, if I've just gone on a trip somewhere, I really want to respond to the colors I've seen, possibly some narrative aspects related to that trip. If I've just been through some emotional situation, I want to express that some way. And it really is a kind of journaling, but it's a visual journaling, and not always necessarily meant to be understandable by anyone else, but I do think it does communicate something to others, which I suppose is the point of why I'm creating. Yeah, in my artwork, I've begun in the last decade more and more to use words. And I didn't really originally use words. I was somewhat trained when I did go to art school to not use words, and that the visual should say what needs to be said. And at some point I thought, yeah, well, my visual might have a word in it. And more words have been a part of it. And I've always had a fascination with poetry. And in a way, I've always been somewhat jealous of poetry. So I suppose I'm integrating a kind of poetic aspect in my choice of words that I put into my painting. So I guess I could say words often inspire me. When I first saw the work of Cy Twombly, I was fairly young, and I just found it mesmerizing. And it keyed into some aspect of my own love of making a mark, and I loved that it was so uninhibited, that it didn't seem to need to justify itself. It was that energy of the mark, and that stayed with me. And I would say that Cy Twombly's courage and having the ability to just make his mark instinctively from the gut gave me license in a way to explore and say, well, what's my mark? What's my true uninhibited mark? When I'm working in the studio and I'm really on fire, things are really going well, and I'm just really creating with an effortless flow. My body kind of goes into an automatic state, and I feel a great calmness as well as a great energy. And the energy really is directed from elsewhere almost. It's very powerful, and it's very comforting. It's probably the reason I keep going back to the studio, is that kind of fix for that energy. And I can be in the studio and it can be freezing cold, it can be burning hot, it can be anything. And I don't really feel it. I'll feel it later. But in the moment, I'm just really into that process and really into that creation. And that feeling I don't get in any other way other than when I'm creating art. When I was teaching in the 1970s, I was teaching art, and there was a big movement in the public schools to do values clarification for all the different courses. And for art, they decided that the only real value of art was either geometry or math. And of course, that's a nightmare reductive idea of the value of art. And luckily, it was shouted down by almost everyone. Because really, art's a part of our culture. It's a part of our humanity. It's how we express ourselves. It's how we communicate to each other in ways that are unlike any other way. So it's profoundly important that we support art and that we fill our lives with art. That's what it's there for. My my lifetime of making art has really had a lot of surprises in it. I'd say the biggest surprise was the different twists and turns that my art life has taken. That as a kid, I just assumed I would teach art, make art, and that would be what I would do. But as I went through school, as I had different experiences, such as when I left school and I moved to New Mexico and then San Francisco. And when I was in New Mexico, I didn't have really much money, so I went out to the Mesa and I dug up pigments, and then I had paper that I couldn't get big enough paper, so I would weave it into bigger pieces, and I began to make these things called paper weavings. And when I got to San Francisco, I was a big hit. There's this artist from the Mesa, he's making paper weavings, and I had all this success, and I had gallery representation, I had reviews, I was the envy of all my art school friends, and I was like 24, 23 really. So it was sort of amazing, and within 2 to 3 years, I hated it. I hated it. I would go to the gallery and they would say, the earth tones really sell. And I would find myself in the studio, like when I would reach for a blue, my hand would shake. And I would think, earth tone, earth tone. Bit by bit, it really undermined what my art was. And I actually had to make the decision to leave the West Coast, return to the East Coast, kind of start over. And I recognized, which I hadn't known, that my art was something kind of private and also something that my inner child, so to speak, was in charge of. And you try to direct it, you try to corral it, it really undermined it, it really flattened it out. And I wasn't really having those great experiences in the studio anymore. I was sort of creating what I'd already created. And I had the real surprise of creating a new trajectory in my life where I thought, I'm always going to make art, but I'm going to be really careful about how I let myself be marketed or how I let others control it. And that was probably a pretty big surprise for what I expected. And I have maintained that, and that balance is tricky. I would say that the courage that I have to be authentic in my art, I think is probably best described by a statement by Viktor Frankl, who's a Viennese psychiatrist, who had said that we need in life to honor what's our mission, what pulls us, as opposed to what pushes us from life, so that to distinguish the pull from the push. And for me, I really recognized that the pull to my authentic art didn't always necessarily match up to the push or the expectation of the art market or of others. And when I was honoring the push, it didn't feel right. There wasn't a kind of calmness in my center. And when I would honor what was really inspiring me, what was really pulling me, there was a rightness to it. Even if I didn't get some of the benefits of the push or of the commercial world, I had a deeper satisfaction.